Sayın meslektaşlarım, sevgili arkadaşlarım, hepinize iyi akşamlar diliyorum. Türk Pediatrik Kurumu'nun televizyonunun bir başka toplantısında yine hep birlikteyiz. Bu toplantıyı bizlere düzenleyen Nesle firmasına ve Solo Event'e çok teşekkür ediyorum. Şimdi çok değerli bir konuğumuz var yurt dışından. Ben kısa bir şekilde onu sizlere tanıtacağım izninizle. We have a very important guest from Belgium. I know you all know Professor Ivan van den Plas. But I will tell a very short his CV because if I will tell all his CV, I will speak just for 30 or 1 hour. Professor Ivan van den Plas did his medical studies at the Rijks Universiteit Brussels and trained in pediatrics at the same university. He became head of the unit for pediatric gastroenterology and nutrition in 1987 and is head of the Kids Health Castle at the University Hospital Brussels and has the chair of pediatrics since 1994. He has more than 500 publications listed in Medline. His main interests are infant nutrition, probiotics, prebiotics, cow's milk allergy, gastroesophageal reflux, diagnostic procedures, treatment, and functional gastrointestinal disorders. He is also associate editor of different journals, among which all you know, Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition and Nutrients. And tonight, Professor van den Plas will speak on proteins, metabolic programming, and long-term health. Please, Ivan. Thank you. Coming to Turkey to all our home. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. I will start the presentation now. It was a very nice introduction. And I hope that one day soon we'll be live in Turkey again. But now it's from home, as you know. As was said in the introduction, the topic of the presentation is about proteins, metabolic programming, and the effect of that on long-term health. And it all has to do with early nutrition and long-term health outcome. I guess that by now every one of you knows that appropriate nutrition during the first 1,000 days will contribute to later health, and that decrease of obesity is one of these relations between early nutrition and later health. And the goal of this presentation is to show how with appropriate early nutrition, we can decrease the risk to develop obesity later in life. So the first 1,000 days are crucial for that. And the first 1,000 days do not start at birth, but they start at conception. So it's conception, pregnancy, and then the 2 first years of life, which are crucial. So that are the first 1,000 days, which are that critical period for growth and development. Sorry. Excuse. So the window of opportunity lies from preconception to around 24 months of age. And the programming takes place during this period, has a lifelong impact on many aspects of future health. And that future health is both physical growth and metabolic programming. Again, about those first 1,000 days, and the effect on later health. It's of course multifactorial, and now everyone is interested in and focusing on the microbiome, and it's certainly true that the development of the gastrointestinal microbiome plays also in this a major role. But genes are, of course, also very important to our genetic background. But a third factor, which is of major importance, is the environment. And genes don't change over time, but genes important for obesity, they can be put on or off, so they can be made active or quiet. So they can play a role, but they can also switched off, playing no role. And that's through the epigenetic phenomena, which are influenced by nutrients, by toxins, by medications, by hormones, and that's part of the environment. So stimuli, external stimuli, environmental stimuli, nutrition, influences this gene expression through epigenetic processes that selectively switch those genes on and off. So that's with these three factors in genetics, environment, epigenetic factors, and microbiome, these three factors, they program future health outcomes. And we know that, in fact, since a very long time, be it in a different way, during the Second World War, during the Dutch famine period, the famous winter where there was a lack of food in the Netherlands, it was absolutely shown that the effect on later health of those children depended on when in the pregnancy that pregnant women did not receive enough food. So malnutrition during early pregnancy exposure had effects on coronary heart disease, hyperlipidemia, reduced blood clotting, obesity, schizophrenia in the infants. When the mother was already midterm exposure, the effects on later health in that baby was totally different, was obstructive airway disease, microalbuminuria, so renal effects. And in late pregnancy, it was mainly a decreased glucose tolerance and type 2 diabetes, which were the consequences. So the moment when malnutrition occurs through epigenetic factors has a different health outcome on the infant. But now we are not focusing on malnutrition, we are focusing on obesity. And what about maternal obesity during pregnancy? 2 in 3 pregnant women are overweight or obese. And that does have effect on the health outcome of the infant. That has a health effect on placental nutrient delivery. That has epigenetic health outcomes effects. That has effect on the microbiome. And that has effects on inflammation. But certainly placental nutrient delivery predisposes the infant to what he is used to get. So infants during pregnancy of a mother which is obese are predisposed to become obese because of the implementation during pregnancy with too much nutrients. And we just published a paper showing that infants born from mothers who had bariatric surgery before getting pregnant, well, those infants were still at increased risk to become obese because the mothers did not change their eating habits. So that's, of course, also an important factor is the eating habits of the family. So there is a rising trend for childhood obesity. The number of overweight or obese children under 5 years increased from 31 million during the 1990s to almost 40 million in 2017. And also important to acknowledge is that poor countries, developing countries like India, they have the second highest number of obese children. How does that come? Well, that's also because of epigenetic or even genetic factors. Because Indian newborns, they are smaller with comparable or higher adiposity compared to European babies. And that's because of multi-generational undernourished populations have developed the thrifty genes. What is now the thrifty gene? Well, the thrifty gene hypothesis suggests that the carriers of that thrifty genes survive because they deposit fat between famines. So when you live in a country where there is frequently famine, there is a genetic development that you become more obese between those famines when there is enough food in order to have more weight to survive more easily when there is a famine. So it's clear that nutrition and programs our later health outcome, and that early nutrition plays a role lifetime long. And protein is an important nutrient for that programming. And protein influences all aspects of infant growth and development. So main functions of proteins in the body, which are they? Well, they secrete clinical messengers. They are important for the development of enzymes. Of course, energy, they are basis of energy. They are important for transport, for instance, hemoglobin, for the transport of oxygen. They are important for the development of the immune response. They're important for the regulation of fluid and acid-base balance. But of course, absolutely evidenced, they are important for growth because they build the building blocks for construction and replacement of all cells. So protein is important for physical growth. An early protein intake has an important role in promoting appropriate health. So that's the early protein hypothesis. Excessive protein intake in infancy now will result in an increased presence of insulin-reducing amino acids, which will result in increased insulin and increased IGF-1. Which will have effects on more insulin and so less satiety and more eating and a higher adipogenic activity. So excessive protein intake during the first 1,000 days of life, after birth during the first two years, predisposes the child toward increased early weight gain and formation of fat cells. And they never go away. Once you have your fat cells, you have them for always. And this excessive protein will program for later overweight and obesity. So excessive protein intake in infancy increases insulin-releasing amino acids. And which are these amino acids? It's mainly valine, leucine, isoleucine, and threonine. They are the insulin-releasing amino acids, and they stimulate the secretion of insulin. So excessive protein intake leads to increased blood concentration of newly metabolized amino acids, particularly insulin-releasing amino acids. So that increased amino acids results in higher levels of insulin and decreased IGF-1, as said before. So more insulin results in higher fat and lean tissue and accelerated growth. IGF-1 results in more adipogenesis, which will result in an increased weight gain and increased risk for obesity. So it's clear that high amounts of protein early in life will predispose the child to get overweight. So high protein intake could influence the risk of late childhood and adult obesity via the activation of different genes. So participating in the fact that normal adipose tissue growth white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue growth will increase. Regulation of fat cell and whole body organ size will be influenced. And finally, regulation of the systematic glucose and lipid metabolism and brown adipose tissue will all be influenced by the protein intake. So amino acids, energy, growth factors such as insulin and insulin-like growth factors play an important role in activating that pathway, which will predispose to overweight. So what's the best way to feed our infants? Of course, breastfeeding is by far the best way to feed all infants. And breastfeeding in comparison to formula feeding has been shown to decrease the risk of diabetes, to have a positive effect on cognitive development, to decrease the risk for overfeeding of the baby, to decrease morbidity and mortality due to infectious diseases, because breastfeeding protects for infectious diseases compared to formula feeding. So decreased risk for gastrointestinal infections, decreased risk for respiratory tract infections, and last but not least, a decreased risk for allergic diseases. But what is of interest today is the relation between the breastfeeding and the decreased risk of overweight and obesity in childhood and later in life compared to infants which were fed formula. So breastfeeding is an unequaled way of providing ideal food for the growth and development of infants. And the effect of breastfeeding on the risk of developing later obesity is shown in this slide, showing you results on the effects of duration of breastfeeding and the risk to develop overweight. What is shown in this study, which is already 15 years old, is that 1 month longer of exclusive breastfeeding will decrease the risk to develop obesity with 4%. So the longer the breastfeeding, the higher the decreased risk for obesity. So breast milk protein quality and quantity influences growth and short and long-term health. And why is that? Well, because breast milk protein has unique features. They are, of course, the main building block for growth and development. This protein gently trains the immune system, and human breast milk protein recognized as self-regulating the immune system. They are gentle on the digestive and excretion system because they contain a lot of whey, and high whey protein content is easily digested. And the protein content of low protein content protects for overweight. And the proteins in mother's milk programs the metabolic system. And mother's milk does have a high protein quality and a low protein quantity. And that's the key factor why breast milk is the best way to feed all infants, and why breastfeeding is related to a decreased incidence of overweight compared to formula feeding. So what about the protein content in mother's milk compared to cow's milk or compared to formula feeding? So that's illustrated in this slide, where you see that in cow's milk there is all about 3.3 grams per 100 ml of protein in cow's milk. And the black line here is the amount of protein in mother's milk, and you see that during the very first days of life, colostrum, the content is relatively high, but very rapidly it decreases to 1.2 grams per liter, while infant formula in the US and Europe contains much more protein, less than cow's milk, but much more than in mother's milk. And you see here the range of the commercialized formulas up to today, with the highest amount and the lowest amount. So breast milk is a dynamic system because I just showed you the evolution of the protein content over time during duration of breastfeeding to match the needs of the infants, because the amount of protein that the infant needs changes over time. So by adapting to the decreasing growth velocity and associated decrease in protein requirements per kilogram body weight, the decreasing protein content of breast milk is adapted. So that system avoids protein intake in excess of metabolic requirements for the infant because it's adapted day to day. The older the infant gets, the longer the breastfeeding continues, the less protein that is present. And this system also then avoids excessive energy expenditure for the mother because she does not give more energy away than strictly needed for the infant. So what are the benefits of continued breastfeeding on the long-term health? It's a decreased risk of overweight by 4% for each additional month of breastfeeding. And a prolonged partial breastfeeding in combination feeding is also associated with reduced risk of overweight later in life. So even partial breastfeeding is still much better than no breastfeeding at all. So the optimal growth rate is, of course, that of the breastfed baby. That's what is set in the WHO growth standards. So from 0 to 3 months, there is little difference in gaining weight and length between breastfed and formula-fed infants. But between 3 and 12 months, infants fed old formulas with high protein content gain weight and length more rapidly than breastfed infants. Weight gain between birth and 1 year of age predicts the BMI at the age of 5 years. This is a study from Italy, US, and Chile with almost 500 children included. And what it shows you is that there is a variance of body mass index, BMI, at 60 months at the age 5 years, which is explained by the weight gain between 0 to 12 months. And that association is statistically very strong. So the lower the amount of protein during the first year of life, the lower the BMI at 60 months. So low protein content during early life protects for obesity at the age of 5 years. So the evolution of infant formula. What about protein quantity? Modern infant formulas were developed during the 20th century using human milk composition as reference and cow's milk as protein source. You all know that. And I already showed that the protein quantity from cow's milk is different from the protein quantity in mother's milk. So human milk contains about 1.5 grams of protein per 100 kilocal, and cow's milk 5.2 grams per 100 kilogram. And why is that? Well, because simply the physical development of cows and infants is totally different. And cow's milk is developed to feed cows, not to feed infants. So breast milk, infants double in size in 5 months' time. Cows double in size in 6 weeks, 1 month and a half. So a totally different growth rate. So of course, infants have a lower protein requirements because they have a slower growth. That's why there is a lower protein content in breast milk. And cows have a high protein requirement because they need a rapid growth because they double in size in almost 1 month and a half. So there is a high protein content in cow's milk. Today, the minimum protein content in infant formula is 1 gram per 100 kilogram, 1.8. So the minimum content which is recommended by the official instances is much higher than the protein content in human milk. And that recommendation may be too high. Again, human milk and the natural way of programming against excessive adiposity in adulthood. So there is a link, as already said, between growth pathways and early protein intake. Breast milk contains 1.2 gram proteins per 100 ml. Cow's milk contains 3.3 grams proteins per 100 ml. Cow's milk protein contributes to 26% of the total energy, while for breast milk, protein content is only 10% of the total energy. So early protein intakes that exceeds the metabolic requirements, which are more than 15% of the energy, may increase weight gain during infancy and the risk of developing obesity in adulthood. Up to now, we did speak about the quantity, but of course, equally important is the quality of the protein. And whey protein, which is the major protein present in mother's milk, is the protein with the highest quality. And as you all know, in natural cow's milk, it's mainly casein, which is the major protein. So the quality of protein of cow's milk or mother's milk is also totally different. So cow's milk is different from breast milk also in protein quality. As I just said, casein 77% in cow's milk and whey 23%. In breast milk, casein only 30% and whey 70%. So there is a difference in whey-casein ratio that results in different amino acid composition. So historically, high levels of protein in infant formula were necessary in order to achieve equivalent intake of amino acid as with breastfed infants. And that has to do with the quality of the protein. And there is also a difference in digestion of proteins between whey and casein. So let me go back to the previous one. Whey and casein differ because casein remains longer in the stomach. That is necessary to form the curd. It's in water. Whey is water soluble. It's quickly broken down. It's quickly digested. So the whey-casein ratio in breast milk, 70/30, makes it easy to digest by the infant's immature digestive symptoms. And that's shown by differences in gastric emptying between whey and casein. So infants fed human milk have a different gastric emptying than infants fed whey predominant diet. You see the difference illustrated after 2 hours with breast milk. It's 19%, which is still present in the stomach. With whey predominant formula, it's 25%. So high protein quality is an essential prerequisite for low protein quantity, because if you just decrease the quantity and you do not adapt the quality of the protein, the feeding may be deficient in essential amino acid. So a low protein quantity in infant formula is possible only if protein quality is guaranteed to be high. And that's because of the quantity of individual amino acids and the ratio between the different amino acids. So the primary limiting factor in reducing the total protein concentration in infant formula is the ability to provide sufficient quantities of essential amino acids. And the EFSA recognizes the lower protein requirements. So the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, recognizes that protein intake in infants is in excess of requirements and recommends a reduction of protein quality in infant formula and follow-on formula. And they did that in 2014. Protein intakes of infants are generally well above the requirements, as they said. And that's illustrated in this slide also, showing you the difference in protein intake resulting over 2 years' time in weight for length standard deviation. And you see that there is a huge difference between breastfed babies with low protein and formulas with a high protein content. It also shows you, as I already said before, that the difference starts from the age of 3 months onwards. Before the age of 3 months, breastfed milk, breastfed babies and infants fed a high protein formula, the weight gain is similar. So the problem seems to start at the age of 3 months. And breastfeeding is associated with a lower prevalence of obesity at 5-6 years. This is illustrated in this slide for overweight and obesity, where you see in light blue the infants which were never breastfed, and in darker blue those who were ever breastfed. And you see a significant reduction in risk for overweight and obesity in those infants which were ever breastfed. So non-breastfed compared to breastfed is a difference of 22% relative risk reduction. Just by breastfeeding, you decrease by almost 1/5 the risk to develop obesity. So high protein intake is related to earlier adiposity rebound, which is then seen in subjects who become overweight. So this slide illustrates you the evolution over time for high protein and low protein intake. And you see with low and high protein intake, again, that during the first 2-3 months of life, there is no difference. But with the high protein intake, you have an early rebound and a higher BMI at the age of 20 years. While with low protein intake during early infancy, you have a late rebound. And this difference in BMI is, of course, highly statistically significant, and the effect is clinically relevant. So the effect of high protein intake on metabolic outcomes at 6 months is linked to the weight gain. And that's because of the difference in plasma insulinogenic amino acids, such as valine, leucine, and isoleucine, and threonine, as we highlighted before. And that's related also to IGF-1. So high protein intake influences metabolic outcomes, and they are linked to early weight gain. And this is a very complex slide with a lot of data, but showing you that very high protein quality is necessary to ensure infants' amino acids requirements are satisfied, and that the clinical proof of comparable growth patterns as in breastfed infants with low protein infant formula with a protein quality, with a high protein quality. And the clinical evidence of safety in infants needs to be shown, of course. So you did see this slide before with protein content of infant formula commercialized in USA and Europe, and the protein content in mother's milk. So the idea is, what about next generation formulas and formulas with lower protein content and low protein content, but protein with high quality and a protein content which is similar, as you can see in this slide, to the protein content in mother's milk. What about rapid postnatal weight gain? Well, rapid weight gain as an infant is a 4 times higher risk for obesity as an adult. So rapid weight gain, excessive rapid weight gain during early infancy should certainly be avoided. So there have been randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis of infants fed with this low protein infant formula, but protein of high quality, and they showed similar growth patterns and BMI to breastfed infants. So we were able to show that low protein formula can result in the same growth, the same weight gain in formula-fed infants on the long term during the first year of life compared to breastfed infants. So there have been 3 randomized control trials comparing low and high protein formula, showing you here that the weight gain from 0 to 12 months in breastfed infants to the left is the same as in the infants fed to the low protein, while it's statistically significantly higher in the infants fed the high protein content. BMI for those infants at 6 months, 12 months, 36 months, and 5 years breastfeeding or formula with low protein, showing no difference at all. So low protein formula or breastfeeding result in a similar BMI up to the age of 5 years. So effect of low protein formula is that it decreases the risk for obesity with 5.6%, because the risk for obesity prevalence in this population was 10%, in the infants who received the high protein content formula, and only 4.4% in the low protein formula. In the breastfed infants, it was 3%, 2.9%. But so from 10 down to 4.4%, or a reduction with 50%, which is absolutely impressive reduction. So weight gain with those low protein formula is in line with the WHO mean. So this slide shows you the weight at 4 months in infants fed the low protein formula. In the middle, you have the WHO standard, and you see that with all the different studies, the pooled estimate is that there is no difference in weight gain at 4 months between the infants fed this low protein content formula compared to the breastfed infants. And the same is absolutely true for the length. So growth, both length and weight are similar breastfed infants and infants fed low protein formula. Low protein formula has also been shown to have no negative effect on neurodevelopment. There were mental performance at 8 years showed no difference between low or high protein formula groups and breastfed children for all these different factors listed on this slide. Is there an economic benefit perspective to low protein formula? Yes, there is, because there is a risk of developing obesity, as shown, a 10.5% reduction. There is a reduced likelihood of obesity-related diseases, and this likelihood of decrease of direct related health costs. So there is finally also a better productivity due to improvement in individual health status over Healthline. So low protein infant formula does have a socioeconomic positive effect. So early intervention impacts long-term health. Simulation-based economic modeling of infants receiving low-protein infant formula in infancy shows that the earlier you start, the bigger the effect is, the larger the socioeconomic benefits. This brings me to the summary of my presentation. First, prevalence of childhood and adult obesity is increasing worldwide. And obesity is, of course, associated with negative long-term health outcomes. And treating obesity is challenging but very important for our society. Appropriate nutrition during the first 1,000 days is therefore critical. And breast milk provides the optimal nutrition for appropriate growth, no doubt about that. And whey protein predominant formula is easy to digest. Accelerated growth and high protein intake in infancy increase the risk of later obesity. So protein quality can influence long-term health. Reducing the protein in infant formula can reduce the association with later obesity. Low protein formulas produce growth in line with WHO child growth standards for breastfed infants. And a lower intake of protein and thus essential amino acids during infancy or insulin depending amino acid lowers the risk of obesity in later life. And breastfeeding, and if not possible, a low protein content, high protein quality formula helps to reduce the risk for those non-communicable diseases and can have a positive impact on lifelong health. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I will be happy to try to answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Ivan, for your excellent talk. As you mentioned, the breastfeeding is the most important in first 1,000 days for long-term health. There will be some questions, I think. We will wait some questions and waiting. I will ask you one question. I don't know how it's going in Belgium, the complementary feeding. Unfortunately, the rate of breastfeeding is not very high in Turkey. It's 6 months, for example. It's about 14%, just breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding. And after, there are a lot of people who are beginning complementary feeding before 6 months of age. And after 6 months for complementary feeding, how do you advise dairy products? Because as you mentioned, the quality and quantity and the protein of cow's milk is different, and it will cause obesity. Do you advise dairy products?
Okay, a very good question, and I think very important what you bring up. I think that exclusive breastfeeding is also in Belgium not that frequent. I mean, in our hospital and maternity ward, I think it's breastfeeding is 90% or 95% during the first weeks. But since maternity leave in Belgium is only 3 months, at the age of 3 months, it's maybe 25-30%. And even less at 6 months. I think, of course, WHO recommends exclusive breastfeeding up to the age of 6 months. But in those mothers who, for whatever reason, can no longer exclusively breastfeeding, the start of complementary feeding between 4 and 6 months with solids should be discussed. Because there is quite some literature that postponing complementary feeding too late might predispose the risk to develop allergic disease. So I think the moment has come to discuss with the official instances if the recommendations worldwide need to be the same or not. Because it could be that they are different for developing countries than for the industrialized world, where infectious diseases and hygiene play a less role. So start of complementary feeding, solids, vegetables, fruits, instead of starting dairy products could offer a solution, and to the mother to still partially breastfeed and then give complementary feedings. And I think if breastfeeding stops, then it should be replaced by the second choice, infant feeding, which then is infant formula. And that infant formula should be as close as possible to the mother's milk, because not every mother can breastfeed up to the age of 6 months. And I think that a non-breastfed infant has the right to get an as optimal nutrition as possible. Although second choice, it will never be as good as the mother's milk. And that's why it is important to adapt that second choice infant feeding as close as possible to the composition of mother's milk. And low protein and protein of high quality is one of those aspects.
Even after 1 year of age?
Well, I think that up to the age of 3 years, I think. We have in Belgium a recommendation to I don't know if it's really followed, but the official recommendation is to give growing up milks with reduced protein content up to the age of 3 years, because up to between 2 and 3 years, I think it's more than 50% of the children who have 2 to 3 times protein intake above the upper limit. So they are above 250, 300% of the protein intake which is required. And just by changing that to low protein growing up milk, you reduce that number of children with excessive protein intake by 50%. Mm-hmm. And also at that age, it still has an impact on obesity, and that has clearly been shown from literature.
Thank you. We have some questions. We have a question from Professor Fahri Ovalı. Could you comment on the recommended protein intake in small for gestational age infants?
Well, it's certainly true that if I go it the other way, that preterm infants need higher protein content. So the evolution that we see is that preterm formula gets higher and higher protein content because these need more proteins. For small for gestational age, what has been shown is that the weight gain should be very slowly and not too fast. So they should get very, very slowly, closely to the normal, but not too fast. So a high protein content is not recommended also for the small for gestational age, because if they gain weight too fast, they certainly become obese later in life.
We are waiting. I have another question. Protein is important for neurologic development. After beginning the complementary feeding, do you advise for complementary feeding protein meat instead of a dairy product?
For the complementary feeding, I think what we do is relatively fast recommend some meat or fish, but very little amount. It's 15 to 20 grams, which is really not bigger than that. But that's, I was thinking how you call it in English, the hand palm of
of the baby.
Of the baby, not of the adult. Yeah? But so that's 15 to 20 grams, and it's a very, very small amount, but that's what the recommendation is, yes.
For the obesity, the quality of meat is different from cow's milk because it doesn't cause obesity. The amount of leucine.
Yeah, it's certainly different. But nevertheless, too much protein is not necessary, and there was previously a tendency to give too much meat or fish to those infants. But before also the wrong idea of a lot of parents and even healthcare providers was the more the better, and and that's certainly not true. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Ivan. It was very, very important meeting, a very excellent talk. Thank you from Turkish Pediatric Association.
Thank you very
And
much.
I hope we will see you in Turkey very soon.
I hope also. Would be a pleasure.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Hepinize iyi akşamlar diliyorum. Buna çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bu toplantıda bizleri destekledikleri için. Solo'ya çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bu güzel sunumu bize destek sağladıkları için ve tabii ki Türk Pediatri Kurumu'nun televizyonunu yöneten arkadaşlarıma sonsuz teşekkürler. Hepinize iyi akşamlar efendim.